Violence against women and girls is a huge problem. It's a global problem.
Violence against women and girls in the UK is a massively underestimated problem. It's actually much wider than people think and has a much bigger impact.
Violence against women and girls occurs with and contributes to a wider context of gender inequality. And so from our perspective, it's really important that we link it to the UN definition. So having an understanding that you can't think about violence against women and girls without thinking about its placement in terms of gender inequality. So women are abused because of their status as women.
We know from surveys that, and studies that there are deeply held and very prejudicial attitudes around violence against women. Surveys routinely show that, you know, around a third of people think that a woman is to blame for rape or sexual violence because of what she's been wearing, or, you know, her behaviour, or, you know, because of previous sort of sexual history.
Cultures of silence and denial may make it even more difficult for certain women to speak out. For example, in South Asian communities, the patriarchal concepts of power, of honour and shame, are controlling mechanisms that serve to keep women in subjugated positions in their families, prevent them from speaking out, and if they do speak out, they run the risk of being ostracised or worse.
It's incredibly important to talk about masculinity. If we don't critique particularly dominant forms of masculinity, then we don't critique patriarchy, we don't look at misogyny. And violence against women and girls occurs within the context of patriarchy, and therefore we must explore masculinity.
God, the scale of the sexual objectification of women in society today is out of control, really. Persistently portraying women as nothing more than a sum of body parts is not sexy, it's sexist. It completely dehumanises women. It reduces women to sex objects. And we know that in the first step of any oppression, that the first step is to dehumanise the group that is oppressed. And in the case of sexism, the easier it becomes to see women as a sum of body parts and not real people, the easier it becomes to mistreat, to disrespect, and ultimately to act out violence towards women as a group.
And if you think about the backdrop of a very kind of sexualised culture in which we're all living, in terms of, you know, advertising, music videos, video games, you know, magazines, pornography, then, you know, you can see how the kind of culture we live in provides a very conducive context in which violence against women and girls flourishes and contributes to these very prejudicial attitudes, and these attitudes are going to flow through into the criminal justice system as well. So, you know, police, prosecutors, juries, judges, they will also hold prejudicial attitudes.
As black feminists, we are necessarily concerned with how the media represents black women. For example, the way that stories are written when we're talking about violence that disproportionately impacts BME communities is generally unhelpful, and I think, quite frankly, at different points dangerous. So the way that we describe forced marriage, we see forced marriage or honour-based violence described in the media, is really always framed within the exotic other, which is not useful for victims and certainly not useful for communities attempting to challenge these practices.
Modern mainstream pornography is a hugely influential form of mass media that is steeped in sexism. And just as we know with TV and advertising, other forms of mass media, what we see and what we hear affects our attitudes and behaviour. And the same goes for porn. 90% of modern mainstream porn involves some kind of physical aggression that is almost always directed towards women and girls. And the average 8 to 24-year-old man in the UK is watching 2.5 hours of this stuff each week.
It's also really important that within feminism we critique, you know, within or critique of pornography, that we look at the racialisation of pornography. And the racialisation of pornography doesn't just have impact in terms of black women and how they're portrayed, but it does have impact in terms of black men, which then impacts how black boys view themselves and their sense of masculinity.
How prostitution is linked to violence against women more widely is a matter of some dispute. There are those who work on the issues of prostitution and would argue that it's a matter of choice and informed consent. There are others who argue it's always symbolic of inequality and discrimination. We at Eaves take that latter view, that it's symbolic of inequality and discrimination. It's an ongoing sort of systematised form of violence and brutality, and women in prostitution are more likely, 12 times more likely, to be murdered than the average population. And due to the stigma in prostitution, they are finding it much harder to actually access justice and safety. So one of the things we also argue for is that we should not be stigmatising the women in prostitution. We should actually be tackling men's demand for women in prostitution.
I think we're living in quite unprecedented times, politically, socially, economically. We're living in times of austerity, huge economic cutbacks. I passionately believe that the real challenge that we face in terms of violence against women is enforcing the laws that we have. In my own work, working in Southall Black Sisters, we see failures of the state through failures of the police, for example, and social services to protect, even though the laws and the measures and the policies and practices, at least on paper, are there. But they still fail. I can sit here and give case after case after case of black and white women where the police have failed to intervene to protect. And but for their failure, those women would be alive today.
I think responding to so-called honour-based violence, so-called honour killings, forced marriages, FGM, acid violence, in communities where this violence occurs, I think it's really, really important that there is mechanisms put in place, trickling down from the state level, right down to the community level. So a multi-pronged approach. But also what's necessary is specialist provision, specialist services for ensuring that victim survivors can access support and access justice.
So if we think about addressing violence against women and girls, and if I think specifically about BME girls and BME women, we still do not have adequate resources that are focused on the specialist needs and the specialist issues that will impact. And I'm talking about disproportionate impact as well. So I'm talking about the obvious areas such as things like forced marriage, so-called honour-based violence, but I'm also talking about services that respond to women and that take into account their experiences of racism as well as their experiences of violence against women and girls.
One of the things which could be done is to make the services which are used to prevent violence against women and girls legally binding. That's services such as the refuges, the provision of advice, the very specialised forms of support which are needed in these contexts. If that were to be made legally binding, then that would also remove the postcode lottery, which means that only some women in some localities can currently access those services.
So at present we have one-off bits of work here and there to prevent violence against women and girls. The government does not have an overarching programme of work, and what we really need to do is to have a revolution in the way that we approach ending violence against women and girls. We need to tackle these very prejudicial attitudes and myths and stereotypes around violence against women, and we need to be investing in ongoing public campaigns. That's government, local government, councils, public bodies at all levels. You know, this is similar to the investment that we've seen in the drink driving campaigns over decades now, which have changed attitudes.
In particular, With sort of all eyes on the media at this point, and with growing evidence as to the harms and damaging effects of the sexual objectification of women, there's a real opportunity here for policymakers, and an important opportunity to take action against this persistent sexual objectification of women in the press.
At the moment, if we think about prevention work inevitably falls off the agenda, because actually what we do is we focus on crisis, and necessarily so. But if we want to make long-term impact in terms of violence against women and girls, we've got to prevent it from happening. And not just in individual cases, but we've got to invest in primary prevention. That is an inclusive and far-reaching approach to primary prevention.
We are calling on the government to ensure that every school plays its part in tackling violence against women and girls. So this has got to be addressed throughout the whole curriculum, throughout all school policies.
For me, if we're not doing work in schools in a consistent way, then we're not making a difference. And what we're doing forever is putting a plaster on a problem, and understandably so, but we need to do more to prevent violence against women and girls from happening in the first place. If you ask me simply why isn't enough being done, I'd say there's a lack of political will.
Essentially, one of the most important interventions that is necessary, not only at the UK level but internationally by all states, is a political will to address all forms of harmful practices against women and girls who may be affected by this form of violence.
So if we're talking about solutions, then we've also got to talk about solutions at the kind of cultural level, in terms of embedding a culture of rights. We've got to talk about demands to be made of the state in terms of resources, adequate resources, to fund shelters, to fund legal aid work, to fund protection services, social services properly. These are not politically sexy issues, and they fall off the agenda most times. And it takes a considerable amount of political will to actually come out and say that these are important issues, that our society is measured by our failure to protect, and that for an advanced, rich democracy like ours, this is a deficit that we should not tolerate.